My great-grandmother Syverine was born in 1863 on a small farm in Norway. The farm name was Osvold. Osvold sits just up the hill from a lush green forest near a beautiful clear blue lake. It's as magical a place as I've ever seen. I can't imagine leaving it, but the family did, to move to a nearby farm called Frodahl. They didn't stay there long. Syverine would have been about 6 years old when the family packed up and moved to America. I don't know why they left, but at that time in Norway, I think it was getting hard for families to survive on the available land. Johan and Helena and their children Petter, Carl, Syverine, and Johanna Marie arrived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1869. Even though they had lived at Frodahl for only a short time, the family took the Frodahl name when they came to America. That's a bit of a puzzle to the relatives still living in Norway who thought that Osvold would have been a more appropriate name. Syverine's brother Carl was a bachelor all his life. Carl worked as a carpenter and built many homes and buildings in the Strum area. I have shirt studs that belong to Carl Frodahl. Marie married Charlie Jackson and lived, I think, in Minneapolis. Charlie worked for the railroad. One of their daughters died at an early age. When the Frodahls first came to America, they lived near La Crosse, Wisconsin, but settled in Strum. Here, Syverine would meet and eventually marry a handsome young man named Paul Malso. Paul was the brother of Anna Malso, who would marry Syverine's brother, Petter. Syverine and Paul had a good life. They were married for over 50 years. Paul died in December of 1937, and Syverine was suddenly left alone. Even so, Syverine didn't want to leave her home. She would eventually move in with her daughter, but not that winter. My mother, Deverne, who was 12 years old, was sent to live with her grandmother and keep her company. She spent the entire winter there. It was a long winter for her, and she was lonely. As an adult, she mentioned that winter frequently. It always made her sad to remember that time in her life. Syverine and Paul had lived for many years in that big stone house which overlooked the city of Strum. From their house you could look down and see the surrounding valleys for miles around. It was a grand house, 2 stories, brick. It was a large home for the time, and the first house in the area to have electricity. Grandpa Paul had done well in America. Paul's parents hadn't done as well as their son would. Paul's father and mother endured many hardships as first-generation immigrants from Norway. Grandpa Paul was a little boy when his family immigrated to America. They went to La Crosse first, but Paul's father Hans was not satisfied, so they put all their belongings on a wagon and traveled until they came to Strum. My grandpa John used to tell me that it was in Strum that his grandfather Hans made his home because the hills reminded him so much of his beloved Norway. His homesickness never left him, my grandpa said. My mother was homesick too in that big house during the winter that she stayed with her grandmother. It didn't make it any easier that her home was just down the hill. She could even see the farmhouse where she lived with her parents and 3 brothers. It made it worse, she said, to look out at the house every morning and think of the bustling, happy life of her family going on without her. I'm sure that no one realized how sad she was. My mother was not one to complain. So here she was, living with her grandmother in the brick house on the hill. She was the ideal companion for Syverine. She liked to cook and she was fluent in Norwegian. But Syverine wasn't what a lonely 12-year-old girl needed. My mother did have good memories of her grandmother, and they developed a close relationship over the years, despite their rocky start. They hadn't spent much time together before that because my mother and her family lived in northern Minnesota. I think they may have just returned home that spring or the spring before. I also have Syverina's rocking chair. It's called a nursery chair because it is so low to the ground for rocking babies. I'm not sure if Syverina rocked all her babies in it or not, but I like to think that she did. My mother used to tell me that I had gotten my love for animals and being outside from my great-grandma. She spent as much time outside as possible. I also have an envelope of 4-leaf clovers that she collected. I had the impression that Syverina was a bit of a recluse. I'm not sure that she spoke English or if she just didn't want to do so. Family was so important to the Malsos. One of my mother's cousins, on the Trunson side of her family, told me of seeing my Auntie Doris and my Grandpa John walking hand in hand to dinner at the nursing home where they lived in their last years. She said it brought back so many memories for her. She told me that as a young girl, she never tired of watching the Malsos as they enjoyed life together, working, playing, telling stories, and joking, the easy way that they fit together as part of a big, happy family.